I was sent this free game in the mail. It's a game called The Shores of Tripoli. It was designed by Kevin Bertram and published by Fort Circle Games. Now, official Josh Yaks policy is to not accept free things for reviews for two reasons. One, I don't need more things. I live in this rather small basement and don't need to be cluttering it up with more junk. And two, I don't review stuff. I just make videos talking about things that interest me. So when the designer of The Shores of Tripoli contacted me and said, hey, I want to send you my game to do a video about, I sent an email back and said, well, it looks like an awesome game, looks like the type of thing I would enjoy, but I don't review stuff. I just make a video about what happens to catch my interest or catch my attention regarding whatever it is I'm talking about. And the designer said, that's fine. I'll just send you my game and you can just talk about it in whatever manner you wish to do so. And so at that point I couldn't say no. I thought this game does look right up my alley. It does look like the type of thing I would enjoy a lot and have no reason to turn it down. If you want to hear more about my thoughts about reviewing things, I did a recent video that I called Josh Yaks About Art and Artists, you know it's an important topic if there's a colon in the title. Are reviews the wrong approach to creativity? So you can check out that video. I talk a little bit more about why I don't review things or accept free things to review. But here we are, an exception has been made, and I'm looking forward to talking about this particular game. So here's my plan. I intend to make at least 2 videos about the Shores of Tripoli. This video is going to be going over the historical background because it is very much a historical based game. So I'm going to talk a bit about the history. I'm going to do an unboxing of the game itself. Spoilers, you can kind of see it here already, but I'm going to do an unboxing, and I'm going to also talk about some interesting points that came up when I was looking at the historical background. So that's going to be this video. The next video I'm going to make is going to look at the solo play experience. This is a 1 to 2 player game. It is designed primarily as a 2-player game, but it does come with solo rules. So the next video I make sometime down the line, however many weeks from now, is going to look at the solo side of things. And then I would really like to make a 3rd video where I talk about the 2-player experience. The problem is the world right now. I have not played a board game with another adult in about a year now, thanks to the whole situation that's going on in the world. And so it's going to be a little bit tricky to find somebody to play the game with, to try out the 2-player experience. I'm not sure if I'm going to succeed at that. My hope is that I will find somebody to play the game with, and then I can come back and make a 3rd video talking about the 2-player experience with the game. But we'll see whether or not that comes to pass. So for now, let's dive into the historical background of this game. Just before I start, let's look at the geographical setting of the game. So this takes place in the Mediterranean Sea at the north coast of Africa. So along the map here, we have the north coast of Africa, starting on the west end with Morocco, then Algeria, then Tunisia, then Tripolitania, which is modern-day Libya, and then Egypt here in the east. We have the island of Malta over here and the Strait of Gibraltar that is basically coming into the Mediterranean Sea here. The northern African nations here are sort of collectively referred to as the Barbary states for the sake of this history, and they are going to be coming into conflict with the newly formed United States of America. So let's dive into it, going all the way back to ancient Rome. So basically, ever since the fall of Rome, there were Barbary corsairs plying the waters of the Mediterranean, pirating shipping that was going through the kind of southern Mediterranean off the north coast of Africa there. They were capturing ships, enslaving their occupants, and basically stealing the cargo that was in the ships. And a lot of the income was also coming in through the form of ransoming the prisoners too. And in fact, some famous historical people had become prisoners of the Barbary pirates. And before I go further, let me just talk about my sources that I'm relying on here. I have a book called The Wars of the Barbary Pirates, To the Shores of Tripoli, Another colon, The Rise of the U.S. Navy and Marines. You know, it's an especially important book when it has a double colon in the title. And this one is by Gregory Fremont Barnes. It was a very interesting historical read. That's going to be my primary source. I also enjoyed the historical supplement and designer's notes that came with the game. And check out this cover here. Isn't that a cool cover on this little booklet here? So it provided interesting historical background from a lady called Dr. Abby Mullen, and I actually heard her on a supplemental podcast too that was recommended by the designer of the Shores of Tripoli. So I did have a listen to one or two podcasts from a podcast called Preble Hall that talks about the U.S. Navy history. So as I was saying, we have some famous prisoners of the Barbary pirates. In the Wars of the Barbary Pirates, they state, Cervantes, author of Don Quixote, was amongst those who became a prisoner of the Barbary States, as was, over 100 years later, Daniel Defoe of Robinson Crusoe fame. So, a couple of famous authors managed to get themselves nabbed by pirates. So the point being, this piratical problem had been going on for several hundred years, and we jump forward now to 1776, at which point the U.S. declares independence from Britain. The book here makes kind of an interesting note about America's founding as a country. It says that the United States was specifically founded on the basis of a separation of church and state. Yeah, if only that had stuck. It's a bit of a shame. Anyhow, one rather interesting point in this history is that in 1778, just 2 years later, the state of Morocco was the first nation to recognize the U.S. as an independent nation, which is also weird because they would go on to become one of the first nations to declare war against the U.S. But initially, they were, in fact, the first nation to recognize the U.S. as a country. And it wasn't until 1781 that American sovereignty became internationally recognized. One problem with independence, though, is that the U.S. shipping, the merchants and other shipping in the Mediterranean, was no longer under the protection of Britain's Royal Navy, which opened them up to becoming targets of the pirates. These Barbary pirates weren't stupid. They didn't go after the nations with the big powerful navies because they knew that they would be causing some real issues if they did that. So they would tend to pick on the nations that didn't have the means to defend themselves in open war against the North African nations. So this would lead to a long extended conflict between the United States and the Barbary states that lasted from about 1784 until 1815, with most of the open warfare occurring between the years of 1801 and 1805, which happens to be, well, the years covered in the game The Shores of Tripoli are 1801 to 1806, so the game covers those years of primary conflict between the US and the Barbary states. So 1781, the U.S. is internationally recognized. In 1784, an American merchant ship is captured by Moroccan corsairs, kicking off years of treaty talks and threats and general conflict, along with a lot more American shipping being captured and the crews being taken into slavery or ransomed off. Now, for the first several years, the U.S. tried really hard to form treaties with these nations in order to provide safety for their merchant shipping. And we have some rather famous American names who were working on those initial treaties. The book says, in May 1784, Congress instructed the American commissioners in Paris, who were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, to negotiate commercial treaties with Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. These negotiations didn't go particularly well for the U.S. It resulted in the U.S. paying a lot of money to these nations in order to secure peace, only to have these nations continue to capture U.S. shipping and continue to be a problem. Part of the problem, too, with the tribute, the African nations were demanding that part of the tribute occur in the form of actual ships and guns and gunpowder and ammunition. So not only were they demanding this tribute from the US that was costing them a lot of money, but they were also being provided with the means to demand even more tribute because now they could defend themselves better from any resistance to this tribute being paid. So it was kind of a real tough cycle that the US found themselves in with regards to paying this tribute. Other tribute also happened in the form of financial payment and what they called gifts. So I don't know what gifts they were receiving other than these arms and armament, but they were getting a lot of stuff from the US in the process of these negotiations. As a result, in retrospect, there has been a fair bit of criticism leveled against the early American leaders for not having kind of used force right off the bat and put an end to the piracy through the force of arms, rather than trying to work out these peace deals. Now, I appreciate the fact that the US was seeking peaceful ends to the conflict, that they were trying to come to agreements and peace treaties rather than going straight to military intervention, which it would sure be nice if that was the case in modern times too. But the criticism was leveled particularly against George Washington for basically paying out all this money for very little effect. Because part of the problem was, in the meantime, while they were doing these years and years of talks and treaties, the prisoners that had been captured by the pirates were still enslaved and languishing in the various harsh conditions in the African nations. The book says, thus, while many Americans, expressing a sense of righteous indignation, agreed with the cry of millions for defense but not one penny for tribute, successive administrations left American sailors to languish in captivity for a decade. Responsibility for this unsavory policy rests not with some long-forgotten obscure president, but with no less than the iconic George Washington, hero of the Revolutionary War, founding father, and first president, under whose administration the United States became a tributary of the Barbary states. Even great men make mistakes. This, perhaps, was Washington's greatest. So all these talks were so ineffectual that in 1785, the state of Algiers declared war on the US and captured 2 American merchant vessels. Fast forward 8 years to 1793, and Algiers is still capturing a lot of American shipping in the Mediterranean. Finally, in 1794, the U.S. started to put together a navy. So between 1794 and 1797, they go into their first efforts of building several military ships in order to be able to back up their treaty talks. It sure is easier to come to some agreements when you have a strong force of arms to back up the talks that you're trying to accomplish. But in the meantime, these peace talks are costing the U.S. incredible amounts of money. So while they did manage to generally achieve peace in the region in 1797, check this out, it said, thus, over a decade after the United States had first sought to conclude treaties with all the Barbary states, the task had at last been accomplished, though at a massive price, approximately $1.25 million, or roughly a fifth of the annual federal budget. So the U.S. was putting 20% of their annual federal budget to paying off these African nations to leave their shipping alone, which is an unbelievable amount of money, and obviously not sustainable for a long period of time. But in the meantime, the US got distracted by another war from 1798 until 1800. An undeclared war with France, known as the Quasi-War, set back America's conflicts with the Barbary states, while at the same time giving them a larger navy with valuable military experience. So this kind of side war with France distracted them for a few years there. It did allow them to build up their navy, and they did accomplish some pretty remarkable military victories during the course of that conflict. But no sooner is that wrapped up than in 1801, the state of Tripoli declares war on the US. But now America has a navy, so in the same year, 1801, the first U.S. naval force to the Mediterranean under Commodore Richard Dale attempts to get a handle on the situation. Unfortunately, this naval force didn't do much other than escort merchant convoys around the Mediterranean and make a half-hearted attempt to blockade the port of Tripoli. The problem being is they only had larger ships and didn't have the little gunboats that were required to navigate the shallow waters of Tripoli's harbor and coastline. So their big warships would have to sit well back from the harbor, which would allow the Tripolitan ships to kind of sneak in and out, and didn't make for a very effective blockade. So that first naval force wasn't overly effective. The following year in 1802, the second American squadron was dispatched to the Mediterranean, and it was led by Commodore Richard Valentine Morris. That same year in 1802, Morocco now declares war on the US. The first nation to recognize the US as a country is now declaring war on them. Unfortunately for America's Navy, that leader, Commodore Morris, showed very poor judgment throughout his stint at the head of that particular expedition. Here's the first example. From the outset, Morris showed poor judgment. With utter disregard for the dangers to be faced, he brought along his wife and young son. Hey, I'm going to war. Let's bring my wife and my young kid along for the experience. It's kind of a weird decision on his part. And that was just kind of the tip of the iceberg of his incompetence. In fact, charges of incompetence would end up being laid against Morris, and he ended up facing a court-martial for dereliction of duty. So that second squadron to the Mediterranean could be described as being even more of a failure than the first one. Now we get to 1803, and we have the third squadron coming along to the Mediterranean under the command of Commodore Edward Preble. And finally we have somebody who's willing to get a bit more aggressive, and he does come hard after Tripoli in particular by bombarding its fortifications and town and really tightening up that blockade of the harbor. So here finally in 1803 we finally see America stepping up the aggression and getting a little bit more effective with their dealings with the Barbary states. Then the following year in 1804, we have Commodore Samuel Barron leading the 4th American Squadron to the Mediterranean. And then in 1805, something rather remarkable happens. So a guy named William Eaton would head up a force of only 8 US Marines, but about 400 Arab mercenaries. What they did was they gathered in way over in Alexandria, Egypt, and they spent 7 weeks marching more than 500 miles or more than 800 kilometers across the Libyan desert in order to arrive in the Tripolitan city of Dern in order to surprise attack the town and hopefully use the capturing of the town as a means to bring about peace with Tripoli. It's an incredible feat, and it succeeds. On April 26th, they do attack the town. They do succeed in capturing it, but they were successful to the point where they were able to make a peace treaty with the nation, which involved having to turn around and then give that town back again. So they made this incredible march across the desert, only to have to turn around and give the town back, but they did accomplish the goal of a peace treaty with Tripoli. So by 1806, we have a general peace in the area between the US and the Barbary states. Finally, all the force of arms that the US has shown has caused these nations to submit to the US and no longer prey on their shipping. The US isn't at peace for a long time. In 1812 till 1814, the US finds themselves at war with Britain. And no sooner is that over than in 1815, the US finds themselves at war again against Algiers, which is Algeria on this map here. We have a particularly interesting person named Decatur who takes a squadron of ships back to the Mediterranean again. We're going to talk more about Decatur in the last part of this video. He's a very interesting fellow. But it doesn't take long for his show of force to bring about a peace treaty that is quickly arranged by Algiers, and that is followed by treaties with Tunis, or Tunisia, and Tripoli. So once again, we finally have a more lasting peace between the US and the Barbary states, which then causes a shift in focus. In 1816, the focus shifts to getting all of the European prisoners and slaves released by the Barbary states and to abolish white slavery. So, yeah, they've successfully freed all the US slaves and citizens. Now we have the Europeans coming in and going, hey, we want to free our people too. And they managed to do so with considerable success. Fast forward to 1830, and the French capture the city of Algiers, and this time they do hold on to it for themselves as a French possession. Now, that would start the awful trend of colonization and looting of Africa that would be carried out by the European nations until 1847, which is a whole other horrible history. But at that point, we can finally say the problem of the Barbary pirates is solved, and both the US and the European nations can now trade more freely in the Mediterranean. So that's a real quick overview of the history that was going on at the time that this game is based on. I'm going to do an unboxing of the game components here. Speaking of history, we're going to travel back in time to the day that this game arrived in the mail. Within hours of my receiving the game, I was filming this unboxing, so I'm going to insert that here. Then we're going to come back and talk more about some really interesting things that came up during the course of talking about the broader history. Just before I dive into the unboxing, I want to take a second to send out a very big thank you to my Patreon supporters. I'd like to welcome a new supporter, Paul. It's really great to have you supporting my channel. A special thank you, as always, goes out to another of my level 2 supporters, Joanna. Your support means the world to me. And for all my supporters, the fact that there are people out there who are willing to put their money into it to help me succeed, that there's people out there rooting for me and who are willing to show both support and appreciation is just unbelievable. So thanks to all of you. I've got the shrink off the box here, and I'm excited to dive in and see what's inside. I don't know what I was expecting, but I guess in the back of my head I had this idea that it was a little self-published game that came into being through Kickstarter, and so I was thinking, self-published, little 1 to 2 player game. I guess I was not expecting too much out of it, but it's actually a decent sized box here with gorgeous cover art. I really like the cover art that's on here, and then when we turn it to the back, we get a pretty good idea of what comes inside the box. So right off the bat, the box has got some good heft to it, and I have to say, this cardboard is thick cardboard. I've rarely seen a box so sturdy and thick, to be honest with you. It's very impressive. I'm already kind of blown away, and I haven't even gotten into the box yet. So let's see what we've got. We've got another beautiful cover here on this historical supplement and designer's notes. That is awesome. It's a separate rule book for the rules of the game, and we have a supplemental historical designer's notes. I love it when a historical based game comes with just a little historical supplement to talk a little bit about the history that the game is based on. But with this game, you get a whole separate booklet that talks about the history of it all. I'm definitely going to read all of this. A lot more history here, and then designer's notes, which is fantastic, and a suggested bibliography. So lots of great stuff here, and then of course all the Kickstarter backers. So that's really neat. Really nice booklets here. The Shores of Tripoli rule book. So it's a very clearly laid out book by the looks of it. Not much in the way of illustrations. Oh, here we go. We got some component illustrations and whatnot. But a little 12-page rule book to get through. And then what is this? Wow, that's an interesting paper, first of all. It's kind of thicker than your average, and it doesn't feel like cardstock. It feels like I don't know what that is, almost like a interesting parchment. To Yusuf Koromanli, Pasha and Bey of Tripoli, May 21st, 1801. Great and respected friend. Interesting. Well, I do know from my reading so far that there was a lot of attempts at negotiations between the USA and the North African nations. So perhaps this is a reproduction of an attempted treaty. I'm going to have to read the whole thing to find out for sure. But that's a really cool edition. It's got that kind of aged look to it as well. And such a really neat feel to it. It's a very interesting parchment type thing. Now, look at all this stuff. Got some beautiful dice. I'm a sucker for dice. Got plenty of dice there, which is great. Love it. I'm going to crack open those wooden bits in a second, but you've got a deck of cards, Nice illustration on the back of them here. Wow, very cool historical, almost paintings, I guess. See if I can open these cards. Just cut my nails. All right. Wow, very cool paintings from the era to illustrate the cards. Those look super nice. Very cool. You got a couple of different figures on the back. I assume a deck for the USA and a deck for the North African pirate nations. Looks very nice. Now we got a bunch of wood, and another thing I'm a total sucker for, other than dice, are wooden boats. Oh, that's cool. We got some boats representing the frigates, I guess, and the gunboats. Those are pretty nice. I like those. And then we have, by the looks of it, some wooden coins. Very large, chunky wooden coins. Got our requisite wooden cubes there. And let's pull out this map. If I can do this. This is turning into a Dice Tower component drop practically. Well, it's a very long map. And at first glance, it looks rather plain. Now, on the one hand, it looks very, very clear for ease of play. Although, I tend to like a little bit more detail in my maps. But hey, you can definitely tell at a glance what's going on here with the different ports, presumably the area that is covers the port area from the sea. And a nice thick mounted map there that is very nice. So all in all, I am really quite impressed with all of these high quality components here. Like I said, it was a lot more than I was expecting from this self-published title. So it makes me super excited to get into it and to read up on some of that history that's included, which is a very neat feature. And speaking of which, I did actually pick up a book to get a head start on my historical reading. So I have this book called The Wars of the Barbary Pirates to the Shores of Tripoli, The Rise of the U.S. Navy and Marines by Gregory Fremont Barnes. And I'm about 2/3 of the way through this book already. So I've got a head start on reading up on some of the history. I've listened to a couple of podcasts, and now I'm looking forward to reading the rule book and learning this game. I'm quite blown away by what I'm seeing here, so hopefully the gameplay lives up to the excellent production. Okay, we're going to finish off here by looking at some very interesting points that came up as I was going through the history here. The first is a clarification that was very important to both the author of this book and to the game designer. And that is, there's apparently an attitude out there that the wars against the Barbary pirates were the first example of Christian nations defending themselves against Islamic terrorism. And here's why the author and the game designer are so dead against that idea. While it is true that the people at the time had this attitude, here's a quote from one of the British leaders at the time who says, "The battle was fairly at issue between a handful of Britons in the noble cause of Christianity and a horde of fanatics assembled around their city and enclosed within its fortifications to obey the dictates of their despot." So, yeah, at the time, the people considered themselves the noble Christians against the Islamic savages, but that wasn't the main focus. The book starts off by... It's totally falling apart on me. I've spent so much time flipping through this book that the pages won't stay in place anymore. So the book when talking about these conflicts, says, "In some respects, this was not war at all, for the Barbary states had no interest in achieving political advantage over their enemies, nor was the practice of piracy ideological in nature or the product of religious hatred. Raiding commercial vessels was a business, and indeed, a state-sponsored enterprise." So, it was strictly business, in other words. The author clarifies this further towards the end of the book. Despite the many parallels recently drawn between these conflicts and that between United States and Al-Qaeda, the historical record does not lend itself to comparison. In short, the Barbary Wars did not constitute, as at least one author maintains, America's first war on terror. Now, that having been clarified, these conflicts do represent several other firsts for America. In fact, it was the first for several military milestones. It was the first war in which the U.S. attempted to blockade a foreign port, the first war in which the U.S. shelled a foreign capital, and the first war in which the U.S. landed troops on foreign soil, which occurred in 1805 in Tripoli when the first U.S. flag was planted. Some more questionable firsts, including some new increased powers for the President of the United States. We read, "Thus, the conflict set two important precedents in American foreign policy. The President's right to engage in hostilities without a declaration of war, and the right, based on the President's own definition of a just war, to subvert a foreign government, what has recently become known as regime change." We see the questionable nature of these choices as history progresses, when the author talks a little bit further about these presidential powers, saying, "Thus, the president was free to take offensive action without further recourse to congressional approval. A precedent had been set by which future presidents could dispatch even substantial armed forces for service abroad without strict adherence to the letter of the Constitution, the most prominent modern example being President Lyndon Johnson's deployment of hundreds of thousands of troops to Vietnam beginning in 1965. So yeah, some maybe unfortunate precedents being set here in these conflicts. But let's get on to some action now. What's interesting is we have some very specific descriptions of individual actions during the battles that were happening during this period. We have one here that didn't actually happen during a battle. It was just a couple guys hanging out around town, I think. We have a guy named Richard Summers, who commanded the 12-gun schooner Nautilus under the command of Preble, was not a man to be toyed with. While on shore leave in the Sicilian port of Syracuse with two fellow officers, a group of 5 brigands confronted him in search of money. Summers parried a sword thrust with his bare hand and then killed his assailant with the man's own sword. That's pretty badass. But the most badass character of these stories is a guy named Captain Stephen Decatur, the guy I told you we were going to come back to a bit later. At the beginning of these stories here, he's a 25-year-old captain, and at one point, one of the U.S. naval vessels, named the Philadelphia, gets captured by Tripoli and brought back to the port of Tripoli. And the U.S. is like, this can't happen. We can't have our ship being used against us by the Tripolitan pirates. So they were like, we need to destroy this ship. And so the 25-year-old Captain Decatur volunteers to lead a force that ultimately snuck into the harbor in a boat. They blew up the captured Philadelphia, and then they managed to sail away again and succeeded in their mission to blow up the ship rather than have it be used by the enemy. This same Decatur finds himself at another battle here. Once again, this battle occurs within the port of Tripoli, and things were going well for the Americans. It said, American success appeared complete until, as the gunboats began to withdraw from the harbor, Decatur learned of his brother's death. James Decatur had forced a Tripolitan gunboat to surrender, but as he had jumped aboard to claim his prize, the enemy captain, brandishing a pistol, had shot him in the head. He had fallen back into his own boat, and in the confusion the enemy had made their escape. Tripp dropped back and brought the dreadful news to Stephen Decatur, who, enraged, promptly steered steered for the gunboats that he thought was responsible for his brother's death, seeking revenge. It is not clear if in fact he caught up with the gunboat actually responsible, but Decatur and 11 other sailors leapt the rails and boarded the enemy vessel nonetheless. Alexander Mackenzie, a participant in the action, wrote an account of it for Preble, describing the Tripolitan captain as gigantic and brandishing a heavily ironed boarding pike. With this, he challenged Decatur, but in parrying the thrust, the American broke his cutlass at the hilt. The captain made another thrust, piercing Decatur's arm and cutting into his chest. Decatur, tearing the weapon from the wound, took hold of his assailant, and as the two men grappled on the deck, another Tripolitan swung his sword at Decatur's head from behind. A severely wounded American sailor named Reuben James, whose injuries prevented the use of his arms, interposed his body and took the blow himself on his own head. As Decatur and the Tripolitan captain struggled on the deck, Decatur pulled a pistol from his belt, thrust it against the back of his antagonist, and pulled the trigger. As Mackenzie later described the scene, Decatur, disengaging himself from the heap of wounded and slain, which the struggle had gathered around him, stood again that day a victor on the enemy's deck. It just really highlights the intense, personal, in-your-face, hand-to-hand combat that was the type of fighting that was going on with these battles. Here's another character whose bravery didn't quite pay off for him. So when I was talking about that incredible march across the Libyan desert to attack the town of Derna, before they attacked, they wrote basically demanding surrender. So it says, while Eaton wrote a conciliatory letter on the 26th, seeking the garrison's capitulation in the name of Hammett, the town's governor was in no mood to oblige, returning the ominous answer, quote, "My head or yours," end quote. It's a pretty brave answer. Unfortunately for him, he did lose his town to Eaton and his force. And then one final act of bravery here. It happens when the British in 1816 were bombarding the port of Algiers, and the British commander, Exmouth, proudly declared in his report to the Admiralty, and so devoted was every creature in the fleet that even British women served at the same guns with their husbands, and, during a contest of many hours, never shrank from danger, but animated all around them. So it's kind of interesting that the British wives were fighting alongside their husbands at the guns. But despite all this daring do and bravery, the heads, the top people here, also show themselves to be utterly vain and immature at the same time. So here's our first example from Commodore Dale, who was the leader of the first expedition to the Mediterranean. The book says, ambitious to the point of arrogance, Dale soon resigned his commission as a result of a dispute over his desire to become an admiral, a rank that did not yet exist in the Navy, and one which Congress declined to create especially for Dale's sake. So Dale was like, I want to be an admiral. And the US was like, we don't have admirals. So Dale was like, well, I quit then. And then along comes the guy who was supposed to replace him. Ideally, command of the Mediterranean squadron, such as it was, ought to have passed to Captain Thomas Truxton, whose heroic fight with the French frigate Insurgente a few years earlier more than recommended him for the post. Yet his desire for status irritated Congress, for he claimed that, as a commodore, and in conformity with the practice of European navies, he was entitled to have a captain aboard his flagship, the Chesapeake. The Department of the Navy refused to comply, prompting Truxton to resign his commission, an unfortunate loss for the nation. Was it, though, unfortunate? And then we move to Commodore Preble, who was the leader of the third expedition. Let's see why he up and quit. So he had led the third expedition, and they were preparing to launch the fourth squadron to the Mediterranean. And it says, the Secretary of the Navy had assumed that Preble would be prepared to remain on station as second in command. Preble's sense of pride rendered this impossible, and he decided to return to the United States. Even our hero Decatur, who had managed to distinguish himself in battle so bravely, ends up coming to an unfortunate end. From December 20th, 1815, he served as a member of the Board of Navy Commissioners, in which capacity he opposed giving Captain James Barron command of a ship of the line. This resulted in a duel held at Bladensburg, Maryland, and fought at only 8 paces on March 22nd, 1820. Both men were wounded in the contest, Decatur mortally. And it wasn't his first duel either. This guy was a bit hot-headed and was into getting in duels with people, and it ultimately cost him his life. Our final example here comes from the French. The sort of king or leader of Algiers was called a Dey, D-E-Y. So we have, in April 1827, a dispute arose between the French consul and the Dey of Algiers over the failure of the former, on his departure from the Dey's presence, to use diplomatic language deemed sufficiently respectful. When the Dey showed his displeasure by striking the consul with the handle of his fan, oh my goodness, the French government refused to allow this insult to go unpunished, and accordingly dispatched a punitive expedition to Algiers. Skipping ahead a bit, the French, determined to bring an end to the crisis, assembled a large fleet commanded by Admiral Duperrey, which left Toulon on May 26, 1830. So three or 4 years after the guy is struck with a fan, the French are still sending a force to punish Algiers. I mean, talk about starting a war over an insult. So it's just funny to see all these brave fellows who are also at the same time such babies about being treated in certain ways. Now the final point that we'll finish up on is kind of the longer lasting point and a hard one to deal with as well. And that is the hypocrisy of the US in going to all this effort to free the white slaves in Africa, while at the same time keeping thousands and thousands of black slaves in their own country. If a degree of hypocrisy creeps into the debate over the motives behind America's wars against the Barbary states, no more is this so than with respect to the issue of white slavery. Morally reprehensible though the enslavement of Christians by Muslims certainly was, it was no more unpalatable than the Western practice of enslaving black Africans. They talk about some of the similarities and differences between the white slaves and the black slaves. One thing is they mention is that the Muslims refused to enslave fellow Muslims. They would only enslave the Christians, I guess. They talk about another difference being that whereas a white slave in North Africa could hold out some hope of eventual release, the governments did go to a lot of work to try to ransom the slaves if they couldn't actually physically free them. The same could not be said for his black counterpart in North America. It is important, moreover, to compare the scale of slavery as practiced, for instance, in the United States on the one hand, and Algiers on the other. Whereas in 1790 there were nearly 700,000 slaves in America, there were only 3,000 in Algiers. Even an aggregate total for the whole of North Africa would not begin to approach the scale of slavery as conducted in the United States alone. So yeah, there was a real evil and horrible hypocrisy happening there. And in conclusion, I'm going to read the very last paragraph of the book, which relates directly to this game called the Shores of Tripoli. Thus, the earliest origins of America's now preeminent position on the world stage may be traced back well before the World Wars, to the moment the Stars and Stripes began to flutter in the wind on the shores of Tripoli. And there you have it, all the interesting background to this very interesting game. I'm really looking forward to diving into some solo plays here, and I'm excited to come back with another video down the road talking about my solo experiences, so stay tuned for that. And if you're a history fan or have some experience with the game, comment below and tell me what stands out to you about either the history or this game in particular. I'd really be interested in hearing that. Holy cow, you made it to the end of this video! That really does mean a lot to me. The other thing that means a lot to me is if you would give it a thumb up or subscribe to my channel, or maybe share this video with one person that you think would enjoy it. Cheers! In the Mediterranean, Tripoli, that was recommended by the designer of this particular, indeed, kicking off, along with a lot more, with these, with the, look, I'd welcome. Okay. While Eaton wrote a conciliatory letter on the 26th, seeking the garrison's capitulation, and so devoted was every creature in the fleet that he's like, I want to be an admiral, and they're like, we don't have admirals. And he said,